Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Hope everyone's doing well and surviving this terrible heat. At least if you're anywhere near where I live, it's just been excruciating. You know, it's late July, so what do you expect? But I'm going to complain about it anyway because it's hot. So hello, hope everyone's doing great. Obviously today's theme is Genesis. I've had numerous requests over the course of the past year and a half since I started making videos to talk about Genesis. And I'm not sure I have that much to add that hasn't already been said, but recently discovered a channel about 3 or 4 weeks ago. A guy by the name of Jordan Abel has started a YouTube channel. He actually entered, I think the first video you ever did, Jordan, was for my 500 subs contest back in March. And then there was a lull, you didn't do any videos, and then you recently came back about 4 weeks ago. I found a video of yours that you did a very thorough, complete, very, very good detailed review of the new Paul McCartney CD box set, Pure McCartney. I was so impressed with it. You know, for someone so young, I thought you did such an amazing job. We got to be chit-chatting a bit back and forth, and come to find out that you're definitely interested in starting a channel and getting going. So you requested this video that I do it, and I thought, well, since you're one of many people that have done it, I wanted to give you a little bit of a plug, channel plug, because he's just getting started, guys. He's got like 19 or 20 subs, so I want everyone who's watching this video, he's a little reluctant and a little sluggish to get out of the starting blocks to go make videos, so anybody who's watching this, head over. I'll put a link here so you can easily find it. Jordan Music Reviews. He's titled his channel Jordan Music Reviews, and his name is Jordan Abel. Terrific guy, really nice person, and I think he's got a lot to offer the vinyl community, the music community, and I look forward to hearing a lot more from you, Jordan. So this is my plug for anyone watching this video to head over there, give him a sub, and let's encourage him to make videos. So great job on that Paul McCartney review, and I hope you like this one since you were the one that requested it. So Genesis, such a long, storied history here. It's, I guess, best just to dive right in and get to it. I'll do my best. I'll probably make mistakes. I've got a lot of notes I'm going to have to refer back to. But if I miss something, of course, leave me comments and suggestions and things that I may have overlooked, and I'd be happy to answer all of the comments. I do my very best to be sure to try to answer everybody. Alright, so it all started in March of 1969 with this album here. Now, of course, this is not an original copy. This would be very, very hard, I would think, to find on an original copy back from 1969. I've never seen one. This is a copy from Record Store Day Black Friday 2014. Now, a little interesting story about that is it was originally intended to be a Record Store Day Black Friday release here in the States, but it was delayed because of pressing plant backlog. And it was delayed, I think, about a month, but it finally did come out and I was able to get it, so I was happy for that. This is pressed on very nice 180 gram clear vinyl. Now, the original album, I'm almost certain, does not have the name Genesis on it. It just says From Genesis to Revelation. So interesting that from doing my research for this video, it turns out that the Decca Records, who owned, or who signed Genesis originally, had found a very obscure American band by the same name of Genesis, and they wanted them to change the name. And I think it was Peter Gabriel, or maybe it was Tony Banks, said, no, we're not changing the name, this is what we want to be called. So they had to release this album for fear of copyright issues, or, you know, some crazy thing that it really came out with no band name on it at all. It just said From Genesis to Revelation. So I think that probably hurt sales. But this is very anti-Genesis. So if you're a Genesis fan and you like progressive rock music, this is probably not going to be what you expect, because this is the one album that sounds really nothing like Genesis. Now, the lineup at the time here was Peter Gabriel, Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford. So you had those big three that have been, the founding members of Genesis, and that carried on through the years. Anthony Phillips was also another founding member. And then, interestingly enough, a gentleman by the name of Chris Stewart played drums on one track, "The Silent Sun," and that was the only track he played on. I don't know if he decided he didn't want to be in the band or they didn't want him, but the rest of the drumming on the album was done by a gentleman by the name of John Silver. So I've never heard of either of these guys, so don't know if they went on to do other things in other bands. You'll have to let me know in the comments. But the band had already, once this was released, it didn't really do anything. It didn't sell at all. Decca wanted to, continue to try to push forward, but Genesis, the band, wanted to write songs that were what we're used to, longer songs and more obscure songs and songs that were, a little bit more deeper than this. So Decca basically dropped them. They lost interest in the band. So this was their one and only release from Decca Records. And a gentleman by the name of Jonathan King owns the rights to this album and has released it in several different titles and variants through the years. I don't know if the original has this beautiful gatefold. You'd almost think this was a religious album, and I think it was just a very confusing thing to be put out, because it just was not very specific at all for a brand new band trying to get started. I think there was a lot of PR mistakes on this one, but it's a decent album, really. It just doesn't sound like Genesis. So, other than Peter's vocals, it's very hard to find much in the way of Genesis sounding material on here. I did pick three tracks like I did for my recent video I just completed. 3 favorite tracks. I picked When the Sour Turns to Sweet, The Silent Sun, and In the Beginning are the 3 probably best tracks on this album in my opinion. So it's not much of a go-to album for me, though, I have to admit. I don't listen to it very often, but it's just nice to have for the collection. Record store day item, well, kind of, and just good to have it. So I'm just so buried alive here with stuff. Alright, from there we go to October of 1970, and here's an album that sounds a little bit more like Genesis you might expect them to sound. This is definitely much more of a progressive album. Now, these all come out of these box sets behind me. These are empty boxes here. I've just slit the sides if they look like they're sealed. But I've decided just to show you, for the most part, the items that are in these box sets, because most of these albums are fairly much common, a dime a dozen. You can find them. Usually they're in pretty terrible condition. But whether you want new issues, reissues, older issues, they're out there. So there really isn't anything that hard to find here. So with the exception of maybe the final album, but that's being released now individually as well. So you won't have any trouble. But getting back to Trespass, the lineup on this album here from October 1970 was Gabriel, Banks, Rutherford, Phillips again, and then a gentleman by the name of John Mayhew did drumming on this one and only album for Genesis, Trespass. And a much more likable album for me than its predecessor. This is the direction the band wanted to go. And this was the first album that was featured on the famous Charisma label. You've all seen the labels. You all know what it looks like, so I'm not going to bother taking it out. But this kind of received a very mixed critical reception, and initially was not commercially successful at all. It did reach number 98 in the UK, but that was in 1980, so that was much after the fact. That was after Genesis had the much bigger audience than they did when this was released in 1970. This never has charted on the US album charts, so it was not a commercial success. As I said, this was the first album to feature the band's more folk-influenced progressive sound. Band was unhappy with John Mayhew's drumming, though, when this was recorded, and replaced him shortly after with Phil Collins, who, of course, we all know. And this is the last album, unfortunately, to feature Anthony Phillips. So Anthony Phillips, one of the founding members of Genesis, only appears on the first 2 albums. So an important member of Genesis in their formative years and the foundation of the band, but really, in the grand scheme of things, didn't have much in the way of total input throughout their discography. So 3 favorite tracks here. Well, I did want to note here that Mike Rutherford said that this is the only album that featured songs recorded by the entire band equally. So that's an interesting note here, that, usually when you see Genesis albums, it will say, written by Peter Gabriel or written by Tony Banks. This is the only album in early Genesis days that's credited to the entire band, every song. Top three songs. Well, there's not a lot to pick from here as far as individual songs go, but I picked The Knife, classic. Looking for Someone, and White Mountain. Maybe a little bit more of an obscure track there, but Trespass, definitely good. You might save it if you're new to Genesis till towards the end, because it's not that much of an easy listen. But once you get to it and you start kind of building up to it, this is a good album to get into. Alright, I did pull out just a couple things. Now, I said I wasn't going to show originals as well as the box sets, but I did want to show these because this has been released so many different ways. I have an fairly common here, MCA Records one here. This is the way it was released originally here in America. I think that's like a third pressing. Now, this one actually is a little bit harder to find. This is on ABC Records here. And this, you know, and I'm always interested in the band, so when I see these things, I pick them up, even though I don't need it. But this one is interesting because I think this is much harder to find. It's not in terrific condition. As you can see, the record's just kind of sitting there because the gatefold is falling apart. But it's just on ABC Records, and this is much older. I think this was the second pressing of this album. And then I also have an original. This is the only, I think, only original pressing I have of this album on Charisma. And you can see I paid, you know, a decent amount for that, $16. And that was, you know, 7-8 years ago. Probably go for more than that now. But really no reason to have all this. But, you know, this is the one album that I find to be kind of interesting with all the different pressings and all the variants and all the different labels and all that. So just thought it'd be interesting to show you that I have 4 copies of that record. Alright, moving on. Nursery Cryme, 1971. Now, this is the first album to feature the classic Genesis lineup as a whole. No Anthony Phillips, though, but you've got Peter Gabriel, Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, and Phil Collins, and that's pretty much what early Genesis people know as the band. This is an album that initially received kind of mixed critical reaction. Didn't wow the critics that much, if I'm being honest with you. It did chart. It did not chart until 1974, where it reached number 39 on the British chart. So again, you know, Genesis did not come out of the gate screaming with commercial success. You know, it took quite a while for this build-up. Quite a build-up, especially in America. We're going to be a while before we get to any charting albums in this country. But in the UK, you know, this didn't initially have huge success, but they were building an audience in Europe. Little by little, progressive rock fans were starting to find the band. And what did I write here on notes? Most noteworthy song, The Musical Box, originated from an Anthony Phillips composition called F Sharp. And there is writing credits on here for Anthony Phillips on that particular song called The Musical Box, which is a very famous and fantastic song, and one of my 3 favorites on this album. So he does get writing credits on this because it was originally titled F Sharp, and that was written before he left the band. Top 3 songs here, as I said, The Musical Box, For Absent Friends, and The Return of the Giant Hogweed. So basically side A of this album is the side that I appreciate the most, I guess, of the 2. Again, very long songs, very progressive rock, so if progressive rock isn't your thing, I love the artwork on these things. Absolutely love it. I should have noted who did the artwork on this one because I just absolutely love it. But we better move on or we're going to be here way too long. 1972, October 1972, comes Foxtrot. Again, it's the same lineup apart from... Oh, I messed that up. And I didn't mention Steve Hackett. Steve Hackett had joined the band here, replacing Anthony Phillips, and someone would definitely kill me on that one, so that's my mistake on that one. So if you've already commented, you got to go back and delete that because I caught myself. But yes, Steve Hackett was part of the original classic Genesis lineup. Tony Banks, Peter Gabriel, Mike Rutherford, Steve Hackett, and Phil Collins. So sorry about that, Steve Hackett fans, and there's a lot of you, including me. Okay, back to Foxtrot. Mostly positive reviews on this one. It was most successful album to date. Did reach number 12 in the UK and did not chart in America, so they still hadn't found really much of an American audience at this point in 1972. But this, I did note the sleeve designer on this one, but a gentleman by the name of Paul Whitehead. So I'm glad I did that on my notes, because that's why we make notes, so we don't forget things. But I absolutely love the artwork on early Genesis albums. I'm pretty sure everyone will agree with me on that. It is stunning. So Paul Whitehead gets credit for that. On the back cover of for Nursery Cryme can be seen depicted in the background. So I guess let's see if I can find that somewhere here. This says there's oh yeah, you can see it here in the sand. You can see bits and pieces of the Nursery Cryme artwork here in the background. So I'm trying to best I can to follow along with my notes here. Top 3 songs on this album here: Watcher of the Skies, classic Genesis, Get 'Em Out by Friday, and of course Supper's Ready, the 23-minute epic track that is still a very big fan favorite to this day, including me. I love that song. Okay, so I messed this up here. Cover art is a painting by Betty Stanwyck called The Dream. Do I have this right here? I think I've confused these two albums. I think it's the next one here that note should be on, Betty Stanwyck. I think that's coming up, so just forget that. I think I got my lines crossed there. I'm not saying I'm perfect on these guys. I really am not. But anyway, there's Foxtrot for you. And then we've got a personal favorite from the early Genesis albums is Selling England by the Pound. Now this is the one out of the box set. It's a non-gatefold on this one. And I didn't pull out my older copies, so I do think this has always been a non-gatefold, because they were pretty faithful to restoring these and reproducing them very faithfully. So this was released in October of 1973, same lineup, same 5 guys, peaked at number 3 in the UK, and this was the first charting album in the US, reaching number 70, so at least they finally found somewhat of an American audience on here. Songs covered themes such as the loss of the English folk culture and increased American influence in the UK. So, you know, it's an important album in the history of the band. I would say this is probably their first, maybe most accessible album, I guess, listening-wise. Definitely easier to listen to than the first 4, really the first 3, because the first one most people don't even count. But Steve Hackett is quoted as saying this is his favorite Genesis album, and you know, he's obviously wasn't a member that late into their career, but this is Steve Hackett's personal favorite. Gabriel has been quoted in saying that he wrote the lyrics for this album in 2 days, so that's pretty remarkable that you can write an entire album's worth of lyrics in 2 days. Top 3 songs on this one would be Dancing with the Moonlight Night, I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe, and The Cinema Show. So you're kind of seeing a theme here that I'd stick to, I guess, more of the classic, more loved Genesis songs, which is not, you know, I have no shame in that. I mean, those are fantastic songs. The Cinema Show on this one, and you know, what else did I say on the Supper's Ready? I mean, come on, you know, those are loved songs. So Selling England by the Pound, you know, this is one of their very best albums. And then that leads us to the last album by Peter Gabriel's portion, his tenure in Genesis, is the absolute classic, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Now, I could spend an hour just talking about this album. It's probably one of the most talked about progressive rock albums in history. And it's just so nice to have this on such a good sounding 180 gram reissue, because I think I had 2 other copies of this and they just sounded terrible. So it's so good to have a remastered, nice, clean, no cracks and pops. It's just, you really can't appreciate. Now this is an album that you need to hear in a whole. I didn't pick 3 songs on this one because this is, if there's ever been an album, it's kind of like the Who's Tommy, Quadrophenia. This is an album. And there really is no songs that they just don't have any meaning if you don't hear the whole album. So I didn't pick 3 songs on this one, and I think you guys would understand that. Ultimate concept album centering around a young Puerto Rican named Rael in New York City and his journey into self-discovery. So just one little quick note about the theme of this album, if you don't know that. Initially, this received kind of a mixed critical reaction, if I'm being honest. You know, you can go back and read reviews from when it first came out online. They're still available. And it wasn't received as one of the best albums of all time like it is now. This one took some time to get to that stature, but now is widely regarded as one of the best concept albums of all time. This, at the time, reached number 10 in the UK and number 41 in America. Brian Eno contributed vocal effects on the album and is credited on the album as, I'll probably butcher this, Enosifications. You know, yeah, it's typical Brian Eno at the time. You know, he was he had his thumbprint on a lot of different things in that period of the early to late 70s, and he, you know, was always tinkering with something. So let's see, what else did I write here? During their stop in Cleveland in 1974, Gabriel told the band that he would be leaving on the conclusion of that tour. He explained his disillusion with the music industry and wanted to spend extended time with his family. I think his wife was going through a very difficult pregnancy, and it certainly makes sense. Tony Banks here is quoted as Peter was getting too big for the group. He was being portrayed as he was the man, quote unquote the man, and it wasn't like that. It was a very difficult thing to accommodate, so it was actually a bit of a relief. And that's Tony Banks. Tony Banks has a pretty big ego, so I think the band obviously were shocked by that news and disappointed at the time. And of course, it's easy to go back and reflect now that it was, of a relief, but I don't think anybody at that time said it was a relief. I think that's a bit of Tony Banks being Tony Banks, but I love Tony Banks for his music, but he's got his nose in the air a lot. Top 3 songs, as I said, I'm not mentioning songs on this album. So anyway, it's a fantastic concept album. This would take a long time to go through bit by bit, but this is an album that I initially didn't get. This takes a lot of listens to really get and to sink your teeth into. Now, it's not my personal favorite Genesis album. Now, I know I might be absolutely massacred for that, but I think some of their other work is more suited for my musical taste. So a little self-indulgent, I think it is. In that way, maybe it was good parting of the ways for Peter Gabriel to go on his own, because we all know he's gone on to do remarkable things. And Genesis went on to achieve much more greater commercial success without him. So early Genesis, later Genesis, I love it all, really, I do. So I don't have a favorite period. I don't really see a need to go back, say this is better than the other. I like the pop side of Genesis. I like this very heavy progressive side of Genesis as well. Just depends on the mood, but I think the band has always been fantastic. I suppose it's as good a time as any to talk about this archive box set. This is archive box set number 1, because this is the early years, obviously from 67 to 75. And this covers the Peter Gabriel era of the band. And this is a, let's see, 4 CD. Yeah, you get 4 beautiful. This is an absolutely wonderful CD. A lot of the information I got on my notes here came right out of the liner notes of this book. And, we just can't be here long enough to go through every detail, but I think this is out of print now. But the most interesting thing about this is the only place you can get a total live concert of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. It's never been released individually. It's only been in this box set. So if you want to hear The Lamb in its entirety, this is the only place you can hear it live that I know of. Now, if I'm wrong, correct me, and I suppose that'll change someday. They'll put it out in another format, but for now, I think this is the only way you can hear the entire album in its entirety live. It's wonderful. All right, I'm going to flip my page here, get on to page 2. Alright, so Genesis auditioned over 4,000 submissions of tapes to try to find a different lead singer after Peter Gabriel left, and after exhausting can you imagine listening to 400 different tapes of different singers, they persuaded Phil Collins to sing on What Song Was It, Squonk. They apparently wanted to get that recorded, and they said, well, look, Phil, you just do it, and he did it, everyone loved it, and that encouraged him to carry on, and they said, we think we found our singer. So that recording session led to 1976's A Trick of the Tail. I love this album. I think this was a breakthrough for Genesis, really, because it was time for Peter to move on, in my opinion. Between the costumes and the theatrics of Peter Gabriel, I didn't really touch on that at all. It really had gotten to the point where it was overpowering the band. The look and the costume changes and the theatrics and the dramatization, and it almost felt like you're watching a Broadway play or something as opposed to a rock concert. And that can only last for so long before you start becoming a novelty. And I think that's what would have happened with Genesis. It would have just worn itself out. So I think it was the best possible move for both Genesis and for Peter to move on. and subsequently it resulted in a very, very fine album. This received both critical and commercial success upon its release, reaching number 3 in the UK, so they had their greatest success right out of the gate without Peter. Now, I don't mean that as a slight to early Genesis or Peter. I'm a huge Peter Gabriel fan. I've already done my video on him. You know I love Peter Gabriel. But for me, it was the right move for both parties to move on. And I think audiences agreed. Unlike Gabriel's theatrical presentation, Phil Collins developed a kind of a humorous banter with the audience in live performance, and it was very well received, and it led to big sales. So, top 3 songs on this album are Dance on the Volcano, Ripples, love that song, Beautiful Love Song, and Los Endos. So, just briefly show you the inside. This is, again, very, very faithfully done with almost original feeling paper. You know, it's got a very nice texture to the cover, just like the original copies would feel and look like. So just really got to hand it to the designers here. They've done such a beautiful job reproducing these albums. I'm trying to go fast. What time? Oh, 24 minutes. And this is going to be way too long. 1976, Wind and Wuthering, another very fine album. Steve Hackett was still with the band. This is Hackett's last album with Genesis. So, in the effort of trying to speed things up a little bit, Collins spoke of Hackett's request of leaving. We just wanted to use what. Well, the build-up is that Steve Hackett had written a lot of guitar parts for this album. Turns out that most of them were rejected, and they went with more of a keyboard sound. Tony Banks kind of really overtook this album. Steve Hackett found that to be troubling, and basically Phil Collins said, look, you know, we're not picking favorites, we're just going what we think is the best music, and that led to his departure. So he had already released a solo album, the Voyage of the Alkalites, I think it's called. Had some success with that, so I think that also kind of pushed him out the door a little bit. So there's probably a lot more to it that I'm only glazing over. I just made, you know, little bullet points that I'm trying to follow along with, so don't shoot me here. This is the first album really that has a lot less of the thematic and fantasy themes on it, and it let's see, first US chart single ever was Your Own Special Way, reached number 62. So 3 favorite tracks on this album would be One for the Vine, Afterglow, and Your Own Special Way. And to me, this is really a very shining moment for Tony Banks. This is one of his best albums, and his signature print is all over this album. So if you're a Tony Banks fan like I am, this is a great album to get. It also led to 1977, Genesis released an extended play called Spot the Pigeon. These were non-album tracks containing 3 songs recorded during the Wind and Wuthering sessions, but were left off the final track selections. Pigeons, Match of the Day, and Inside Out. Spot the Pigeon reached number 14 in the UK. So this is not an original copy, obviously. There are some out there. This is a Record Store Day release, I think, from 2013 on blue vinyl. And I would say save your money on this one because it sounds terrible. They did a terrible job on this one. It's just noisy. It has terrible sound quality, and unfortunately, it's. If I ever can get my hands on an original copy, I'd like to have that, because this one, they just didn't do a good job. As much as I'm bragging about the box sets, this one just didn't work out. So anyway, maybe I just got a bad one. I don't know, but it just doesn't sound good. But anyway, there's Spot the Pigeon. This was released about 9 months after Wind and Wuthering. So that was the time to show that. And then I would say this was the start of the big period of Genesis here. And then there were 3. Now, you know, if you're not a fan of the pop part of Genesis, you're probably already switching off the channel. But for me, I like the pop, easy, lighter side of Genesis too. I like Phil Collins' vocals. I like the band from its beginning stages all the way through. This is the first album that obviously featured 3, Phil Collins, Mike Rutherford, and Tony Banks. First album for Atlantic Records in the US, so that's noteworthy. And you know, Mike Rutherford assuming all the guitar parts apart from the live stuff. This was when Daryl Sturmer started adding his flavor to the live performance, and he stuck with them until they stopped touring. I think he even did the tour in Europe in 2007. Daryl Sturmer was a big part of Genesis as a live band. What else did I note here? Album marked a change in the sound, still somewhat faithful to the progressive rock roots, but with a pop-friendly sound. Album received mixed to moderate positive reviews. Follow You, Follow Me was their most successful single to date in the UK, reaching number 7, and it reached number 23 in the US. A large world tour ensued, which added touring guitarist Daryl Stormer, as I just said. Top 3 songs here are Deep in the Motherlode, The Lady Lies, Follow You, Follow Me. So just a terrific album. A lot of people say this is one of their best, and I have no fault with that. I really like that album. All right, so the rest of this part I can go pretty fast because these are really pretty common, well-known, well-loved, very singles-driven albums. Duke, March 1980, beginning with their massive chart success with Duke, reached number 1 in the UK. Number 11 in the US, mostly positive critical response to Duke. I love this album. This was the first, this was the second Genesis album I ever bought. I'm going to backtrack on that. We have not yet reached the first Genesis album that I ever heard. Top 3 songs on this album: Turn It On Again, Please Don't Ask, and Misunderstanding. And I don't mean to gloss over this period, but it's just so commonplace, I guess, that there maybe isn't as much to talk about because most people know these songs so well. Abacab, September 1981, number 2 in the UK, number 1, second UK number 1, sorry. I had to go back and read that again. It reached number 7 in the US. There is a story about how they came up with the name Abacab. It was basically written in 3 segments, and they referred to it as Section A, Section B, and Section C. And the way the original track listing was lined up, it spelled out the word Abacab. Now, it wasn't released that way. There's also about, I think, 5 or 6 different variants in the color patterns on this one. For the box set, maybe it's random, but this is the one I got. I love this album. I think it's just absolute brilliance. I really do. And I know I might get shot for that, but this is probably one of those really, really go-to albums in their discography for me. Top 3 songs are, the whole album's fantastic, but Abacab, No Reply at All, and Dodo/Lurker. I absolutely love those 3. I love the whole album, so it's a beauty. It is a beauty. One more flip of the page here. At least we're getting into the home stretch since I've already passed 30 minutes. Unbelievable. Genesis, self-titled. That came out in October 1983. Band decided to self-title it, as each of the album's 9 songs were written as a group. So, and that was the case from this album on forward till the end. So, this was the first album since Peter Gabriel's departure that they wrote as a group. So they titled it Genesis. Reached number 1 in the UK. This is their 3rd consecutive number 1 album. Reached number 9 in the US, and received a Grammy nomination for Best Rock Performance by a Duo or Group, and was also nominated for Second Home by the Sea, Best Rock Instrumental. This one gets mixed critical response, mixed fan response. I really like it. I think it's underrated. My 3 favorite tracks on here are Mama, Second Home by the Sea, and Just a Job to Do. So, for those that don't like this album, well, keep trying, because it was my first listen of Genesis, and it led to a lifelong addiction of the band. So, maybe it just takes a little bit of time, but this was the first Genesis album I ever bought on cassette tape, and I kind of worked backwards for a little while. I did Abacab, then I did Duke, then Abacab, then I did them, and then there were 3, and then who knows from there. But this is where I started liking Genesis. Finally, we've got their most successful album that they ever had, called Invisible Touch. Probably don't need to go into a great deal about this one because every song on here was pretty much a hit. 5th consecutive number 1 album, reached number 4 in the US, but it did sell over 4 million copies in the US alone, or 6 million copies in the US alone. Sorry, here, yeah, 4th consecutive in the US. UK number 1, reached number 3 in America. My eyes, just terrible. Had 5 top 5 singles in America. I mean, how many rock bands can say that? The music video for Land of Confusion featured Splitting Image puppets and was nominated for MTV's Video of the Year, played to death, and it lost to former lead vocalist Peter Gabriel's Sledgehammer, so that's kind of interesting. Also interesting that Peter Gabriel's So was his most successful album of all time so far, and that was released the same time pretty much that this album was released, and they exchanged chart positions on the singles chart, I think it was. I can't remember if it was singles or albums chart, but anyway, it was a great time to be either a member of Genesis or a former member of Genesis, because they both had their biggest chart successes in 1986. So fantastic album, top 3 songs: Tonight, 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 Dominoes Part 1 and 2, kind of cheating there, and Land of Confusion, but beautiful album. And then finally, the last album of Phil Collins, titled We Can't Dance. I love this album. I don't know. I know people are going to say you're crazy, it's weak, but no, this is not a weak album. I absolutely adore this album. I think this is a real return to form for them. It was, what, 5 years in the making? Yeah, 5 years in the making. 1991, November 91. And it's a double album. It's the 5th consecutive UK #1, reached #4 in the US. So it was a successful album. It just didn't have as many hit singles on it. Contrary to popular belief, Since I Lost You is not about a broken relationship. That song that's on here, Since I Lost You, that was written in, the lyrics were written by Phil Collins for friend Eric Clapton. So you Clapton fans, including you, James Lack, I don't know if you knew that, but Clapton's 4-year-old son Connor had died after falling off a 53-story window off a hotel, I think it was, and Phil Collins lovingly wrote that song, Since I Lost You, for Eric Clapton's son. So that was interesting to find out in researching for this album here. What was nominated for a Brit Award in 1992, and the album was nominated for Best British Album, while Phil Collins was nominated for Best British Male Artist. I absolutely love this album, and I wish it got more respect. I've tried through the years to get people who maybe are not too heavy on it into it, and it's kind of, maybe it's just a personal thing, but I just absolutely love this album. I like the long songs on it. Fading Lights, No Son of Mine, and Living Forever. But I could easily pick Driving the Last Spike very, very easily. Tell Me Why is a beautiful song. Hold On My Heart, absolutely gorgeous Phil Collins ballad. So I love this album. I guess I've made that clear. And then finally they did release one album that did not feature Phil Collins. This is going to be my longest video ever, I swear. Calling All Stations. I'm just going to let it go. It is what it is. It's a long video, guys. You can always fast forward. September 1997 was their attempt to make a album without Phil Collins, and a gentleman by the name of Ray Wilson was chosen as the replacement singer for Phil Collins. Now, this is not a bad album, really isn't, but I think they made their mistake is titling it Genesis, because, you know, the band was able to survive so many things. They survived Anthony Phillips leaving, they survived Peter Gabriel leaving, they survived so many things, but that was before they reached huge commercial success. And once you reach huge commercial success, it's very, very difficult to carry on with an alternate singer. And what was really missing was Phil Collins as a master producer. He's a great songwriter, he really is. And whether you like him or don't, I think you have to admit that he knows how to make hits. And this album just didn't feel like a Genesis album, really. Even though Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford were there on it, it really felt more like a Mike and the Mechanics album, if I'm being honest. But it's not a bad album. There are some redeeming things about this. This is a 2 LP pressing. The 4th side has an etching on it. And they did faithfully. There are original copies out there from 1997, but they used to go for big money. So this is an album, if they hadn't ever re-released it, I didn't think I'd ever get my hands on, but thankfully they have, and it's part of the box set that's behind me, and they are releasing this individually, so you'll be able to get it. Album received scathing reviews, just terrible, the worst of their career by, you know, no comparison, and really so poorly received in America, where they had reached such a huge, you know, stadium-filling levels of popularity that they ended up canceling their U.S. tour because it just didn't go anywhere. So it was a one-off, it was a one-and-done kind of thing for the new Genesis, and feel a little bit bad because I do admire both Mike Rutherford and Phil Collins, or Tony Banks. Ray Wilson is not a bad singer at all. It didn't work as with Genesis. So that's my take on this album. Definitely worth hearing though. It's not a bad record at all. 3 favorite tracks are not hard to find on here. I like Congo, Shipwrecked, and There Must Be Some Other Way. Definitely worth listening to, especially now that you can get your hands on it on vinyl without breaking your bank. We've gone so long, I'm just going to tell you I've got a copy of Genesis Live. This is the one and only live album from Peter Gabriel's era. It's very short, really. It's just one disc, but you can kind of see what I was talking about earlier with theatrics. I've got 2 copies of Seconds Out. This was Phil Collins' first live album with Genesis. This came out in 1977. And then I've got a reissue of that I've kept in the shrink, and I've just slipped aside so I can hear it, but I'm assuming the gatefold is the same. This sounds so good. It's just amazing. I do play this a lot. In fact, I don't think I've ever played the original since I bought that. I've got 2 copies of Three Sides Live that came out in 1992, and the reason I have 2 copies of this is because the 4th side is different. If you live in America, on Atlantic Records, you got a 4th side with studio material that was released in the UK on an EP called 3x3, which I don't have, which I don't need really because they're all on here. Paperlate, You Might Recall, Me and Virgil, Evidence of Autumn, and Open Door are on the 4th side of the American release. On the UK release, you get One for the Vine, Fountain of the Salmonex, and Watcher of the Skies. So it is really 4 sides live on the UK one, and on the US one you get the 3rd side studio material. So you kind of need both, or that EP 3x3. And then finally there's what year is this? 1992. They released The Way We Walk live. I don't have that on vinyl. I should get it. It's not that hard to get. I have a cassette tape. This was really just pop songs. All of their they call it the shorts. Not as much of a need for me to have that really, so I've never bothered to buy it, but I really did want to get the longs, The Way We Walk, the longs, because this has songs on it like the side 1 is an old melody, Dance on the Volcano, Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, Musical Box, Firth the Fifth, I Know What I Like. Side 2 is Driving the Last Bike, Domino Parts 1, In the Glow of the Night, Domino, The Last Domino, Fading Lights, Home by the Sea, Second Home by the Sea. So it's got all the things I love most about Genesis on this one. So that's what I really, really wanted, and I'm so glad to have that. I also have it on cassette, which amazingly sounds great still. What else can I show you? There is an archive box set 2. This covers all the Phil Collins stuff from 1976 through 1992. So you get pretty much everything that they, this is just 3 CDs, but it is just chocked full, and even though it was released much, much later, almost a decade after the first archive, they kept the same format with the book inside and the CDs, and it's you know, a beautiful set when you have both of them, Archive 1 and Archive 2. I don't know how hard these are to get. I haven't looked in a very long time, so hopefully they're still out there if you want them, especially the first one. Most recently they released an archive. This is the only CD package. This is a 3 CD set that contains not only Genesis material but a bit of each of their solo material, so that was kind of fun. So you get a bit of Peter Gabriel, you get a bit of Phil Collins, you get a bit of Mike and the Mechanics, you get a bit of Tony Banks, you get a bit of Steve Hackett, and it's just intermixed with the Genesis stuff. So it's a nice thing to do, I think, to acknowledge you know, each individual member. So maybe a bit of a ploy, a money grab, I guess you could say, but it coincides with the DVD release in the UK anyway, of what was it called? Oh my gosh, I can't think of the name of it. Some of Its Parts? I think it's called Some of Its Parts. I forgot to pull that out. Now I do have a copy of that because I have a region-free player, and it is fantastic. But there's some critics say that some of the members got a little bit shortchanged, like Steve Hackett doesn't get much airtime. Anthony Phillips, if I recall, is not even in it, maybe only like for 2 seconds in the very, very beginning. So it's a little unfortunate they didn't really focus too much on the early days of Genesis, but it is what it is, and this accompaniment CD is a nice to have, and it's good just to throw in the car and listen to. And hopefully Some of Its Parts will get an American release. I don't know why they've never released that. There is another live album out there called Live Over Europe from their 2007 tour. I don't have that. There's many other concerts on DVD. I didn't pull those out. I have a couple, but we've gone on long enough. I can't even see the time because of the glare of the sun, but I think it's past 36 minutes. So I hope you enjoyed it. There's a lot to cover. You know, we're talking about a 40-something year career here, so I guess you can't be too surprised that it's long, but I know I ramble too much. But Anyway, thank you so much for sticking with me. Go check out Jordan's channel, Jordan's music reviews for me, and hit the subscribe button for him. And let's encourage him to make videos. And thank you all so much for watching. We'll be back soon for something different, hopefully a little shorter. And until then, take care of yourselves. Bye for now.